Sarah Martinez walked through the hospital corridors with a noticeable limp, her left leg dragging slightly behind her right. The other nurses often whispered when they thought she couldn't hear them. "Poor Sarah," they would say. "She tries so hard, but she's just not cut out for this job." Some doctors barely acknowledged her presence, assuming her physical limitation made her less capable than her colleagues. At 28 years old, Sarah had been working at Metropolitan General Hospital for 3 years. Every morning she arrived early, stayed late, and pushed herself harder than anyone else on the medical team. But no matter how dedicated she was, people seemed to focus only on her limp. They saw weakness where there was actually incredible strength. The limp had been with Sarah since she was 19 years old. Most people assumed it was from a birth defect or childhood accident. They never asked. And Sarah never volunteered the real story. The truth was far more complicated and painful than anyone could imagine. Her leg had been shattered during an event that changed her life forever, but also shaped her into the person she had become. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, Sarah was assigned to the emergency room. It was always the busiest department in the hospital, especially during the day shift. Ambulances came and went constantly, bringing in everything from heart attack victims to car accident survivors. The emergency room required quick thinking, fast movement, and the ability to handle extreme pressure. Many of her colleagues wondered why Sarah chose to work in such a demanding environment given her physical limitations. Dr. Fociano Williams, the head of emergency medicine, watched Sarah work from across the room. He had mixed feelings about her assignment to his department. On one hand, Sarah was incredibly knowledgeable and showed genuine compassion for patients. On the other hand, he worried that her limp would slow down response times in critical situations. In emergency medicine, every second counted, and he couldn't afford to have team members who couldn't keep up with the pace. "Sarah," Dr. Williams called out as she finished checking on a patient with a broken arm. "Can you handle the trauma bay today? We're expecting a busy afternoon." Sarah nodded without hesitation. "Of course, Dr. Williams. I'm ready for whatever comes in." The trauma bay was where the most serious cases arrived. Gunshot wounds, severe car accidents, and other life-threatening emergencies all came through those doors. It required the medical team to work together seamlessly, moving quickly and efficiently to save lives. Sarah knew that Dr. Williams was testing her, seeing if she could handle the pressure and physical demands of the most challenging area in the emergency room. Around noon, the first major case arrived. A construction worker had fallen from a building and suffered multiple injuries. As the paramedics rushed him in, Sarah immediately sprang into action. Despite her limp, she moved with surprising speed and precision. Her hands were steady as she helped establish IV lines, monitored vital signs, and assisted the doctors with emergency procedures. "Good work, Sarah. Dr. Cersei." "Dr. Cersei," Williams said quietly as they stabilized the patient. He had to admit that her limp hadn't slowed her down at all. In fact, she seemed to anticipate what was needed before anyone else on the team. The afternoon brought more challenges. A teenage girl arrived after a serious car accident, unconscious and bleeding internally. Sarah coordinated with the surgical team, helped prepare the patient for emergency surgery, and provided comfort to the terrified parents waiting in the hallway. Her calm demeanor and professional expertise helped keep everyone focused during the crisis. As the day wore on, more staff members began to notice something different about Sarah. While her limp was still visible, it didn't seem to affect her performance at all. She moved through the trauma bay with confidence, handling equipment, assisting with procedures, and communicating effectively with doctors, patients, and families. Some of the nurses who had previously whispered about her weakness began to see her in a new light. Dr. Jennifer Chen, a young resident who often worked with Sarah, pulled her aside during a brief quiet moment. "Sarah, I have to ask you something. I've been watching you today, and you're incredible in there. Where did you learn to handle trauma cases so well? Your instincts are amazing." Sarah smiled but didn't elaborate. "I've had some experience with emergency situations before I became a nurse," she said simply. "Sometimes life teaches you things that medical school can't." Dr. Chen wanted to ask more questions, but an ambulance siren in the distance interrupted their conversation. Another emergency was arriving, and they needed to prepare for whatever was coming through those doors. The next case would test Sarah in ways that no one expected. The ambulance brought in a young soldier who had been injured in a training accident at the nearby military base. He was conscious but in severe pain, with multiple fractures and possible internal injuries. As the medical team worked to assess his condition, the soldier kept asking for someone to contact his unit. "My captain," he said weakly. "Please call Captain Morrison. He needs to know what happened." Sarah noticed something in the soldier's voice that others missed. It wasn't just pain or fear. There was a deep respect and loyalty when he mentioned his captain. She had heard that tone before, in a different place and time. It reminded her of something from her past that she had tried hard to forget. While the doctors focused on treating the soldier's injuries, Sarah stayed close to provide emotional support. She held his hand and spoke to him in a calm, reassuring voice. "You're going to be okay," she said. "We're taking good care of you, and we'll make sure your captain knows what happened." The soldier looked at Sarah with gratitude. "Thank you, ma'am. Captain Morrison always says to take care of each other. He's the best leader I've ever served under." Sarah felt a strange emotion rising in her chest. The soldier's words about his captain brought back memories she had spent years trying to suppress. She excused herself for a moment and stepped outside the trauma bay to collect her thoughts. Standing in the hallway, she took several deep breaths and tried to focus on the present moment. When she returned to the trauma bay, the soldier was being prepared for surgery. His injuries were serious but not life-threatening. As they wheeled him toward the operating room, he grabbed Sarah's hand one more time. "Will you really call my captain?" he asked. "I promise," Sarah replied. "What's his full name and unit?" "Captain David Morrison, Navy SEALs, Team 7, the soldier said before the anesthesia took effect. Sarah felt the world stop around her. The name hit her like a physical blow, and she had to steady herself against the wall. Captain David Morrison, Navy SEALs. It couldn't be the same person. It had been almost 10 years since she had heard that name, and she had convinced herself that their paths would never cross again. Williams noticed Sarah's sudden change in demeanor. "Sarah, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," she said quickly, though her voice sounded shaky. "Just tired from the long shift. I'll call the soldiers' unit right away." Sarah walked to the nurse's station and picked up the phone with trembling hands. She dialed the number for the military base and asked to be connected to Captain Morrison's office. As the phone rang, her mind raced back to a time when her life was completely different, when she was a different person entirely. "Captain Morrison's office, this is Petty Officer Jackson," came the voice on the other end of the line. Sarah took a deep breath. "This is Sarah Martinez from Metropolitan General Hospital. We have one of your team members here who was injured in a training accident. Private Rodriguez asked us to contact Captain Morrison. Is Rodriguez going to be okay?" Petty Officer Jackson asked with obvious concern. "He's in surgery now, but the doctors expect a full recovery. The captain might want to come to the hospital to check on him. I'll let the captain know right away." "Which hospital did you say?" "Metropolitan General. Emergency Department. Ask for Sarah Martinez when you arrive." After hanging up the phone, Sarah sat down heavily in a chair. She knew that in a few hours, she would come face to face with the person who had changed her life forever, the person who had saved her life, but also the person whose actions had led to her permanent limp. Captain David Morrison was coming to her hospital, and she had no idea how she would handle seeing him again. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. Sarah went through the motions of caring for patients, but her mind was elsewhere. She kept thinking about the last time she had seen Captain Morrison, 9 years ago, in a military hospital in Afghanistan. She had been lying in a hospital bed, her left leg shattered, and her military career over. He had visited her once before. She was transferred back to the United States, and their conversation had been brief and painful for both of them. As evening approached, Sarah's shift was supposed to end, but she couldn't bring herself to leave, knowing that Captain Morrison would be arriving soon. She volunteered to work overtime, telling herself that she wanted to check on Private Rodriguez after his surgery. In reality, she needed to see Captain Morrison one more time, even though she wasn't sure she was ready for what that encounter might bring. Dr. Williams was impressed by Sarah's dedication. "You've been here for 12 hours already, Sarah. Don't you want to go home and rest?" "Private Rodriguez doesn't have any family in the area," Sarah explained. "I want to make sure he's comfortable when he wakes up from surgery." Around 7 o'clock in the evening, Sarah was checking on Private Rodriguez in the recovery room when she heard familiar voices in the hallway. Her heart began racing as she recognized the authoritative tone she remembered from years ago. Captain Morrison had arrived at the hospital. Sarah stepped into the hallway and saw him for the first time in 9 years. He looked older, with more gray in his hair and deeper lines around his eyes, but he still carried himself with the same confident bearing that had made him such an effective leader. He was talking to Dr. Williams about Private Rodriguez's condition, asking detailed questions about the surgery and recovery timeline. For a moment, Sarah considered walking away before he noticed her. She could finish her shift, go home, and pretend this encounter had never happened. But something inside her knew that this was a moment she needed to face. She had been running from her past for too long. Taking a deep breath, Sarah walked toward the group of men standing near the recovery room. As she approached, Captain Morrison looked up, and their eyes met for the first time in almost a decade. The recognition was immediate and mutual. Both of them froze, uncertain how to handle this unexpected reunion. "Sarah?" Captain Morrison said quietly, his voice filled with surprise and something that might have been regret. "Hello, Captain," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Private Rodriguez is doing well. The surgery was successful." The other people in the hallway could sense the tension between Sarah and Captain Morrison, though they didn't understand the source. Dr. Williams looked back and forth between them, confused by the obvious history they shared. Captain Morrison stepped closer to Sarah, his eyes taking in her nurse's uniform and the slight limp that was still visible after all these years. "You became a nurse," he said, and there was something like pride in his voice. "Yes," Sarah said simply. "It seemed like the right path for me." They stood there for a moment, surrounded by the busy sounds of the hospital but feeling completely isolated from everything around them. 9 years of separation, pain, and unanswered questions hung in the air between them. Neither of them knew how to begin addressing the complicated history they shared. Finally, Captain Morrison spoke again. "Could we talk somewhere private? I think we have a lot to discuss." Sarah nodded, though her heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. "There's a consultation room down the hall. We can talk there." As they walked toward the consultation room, Sarah's mind raced through all the things she had wanted to say to Captain Morrison over the years. She had imagined this moment countless times, but now that it was actually happening, she felt completely unprepared. The man walking beside her had been both her salvation and her destruction, and she wasn't sure which aspect of their shared history would dominate their conversation. The consultation room was small and quiet, with just a table and a few chairs. Sarah closed the door behind them and leaned against it for support. Captain Morrison stood near the window, his back to her, looking out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the darkness. "I never expected to see you again," he said without turning around. "When Petty Officer Jackson told me that a nurse named Sarah Martinez had called about Rodriguez, I wondered if it could be you. But I told myself it was impossible." Sarah remained silent, waiting for him to continue. She had learned patience during her years as a nurse, and she sensed that Captain Morrison needed time to find the right words. "How long have you been working here?" he asked, finally turning to face her. 3 years, Sarah replied. "I finished nursing school 4 years ago and worked at a smaller hospital before coming to Metropolitan General." Captain Morrison nodded slowly. "You always were one of the smartest people I knew. I'm not surprised you became a nurse. Though I have to admit, I'm surprised you chose emergency medicine. Given your..." He paused, looking at her leg. "Given my limp?" Sarah finished for him. "People are always surprised by that. They think I should choose something easier, something that doesn't require so much physical demand." "That's not what I meant," Captain Morrison said quickly. "I know you better than that." "You never chose the easy path, even when you probably should have." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Dr. Williams peered in, looking apologetic for the intrusion. "Sarah, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Private Rodriguez is awake and asking for you. He wants to thank you for staying with him." Sarah looked at Captain Morrison, torn between her duty to her patient and her need to continue this conversation. "We should both go see him," she said. "He was very worried about you during the surgery." As they walked back toward the recovery room, Sarah could feel the eyes of her colleagues following them. The hospital staff had never seen her interact with someone who clearly knew her well, and they were curious about the connection between their quiet, dedicated colleague and this distinguished military officer. Private Rodriguez was groggy from the anesthesia, but alert enough to recognize Captain Morrison when they entered the recovery room. His face lit up despite the pain medication making him drowsy. "Captain," Rodriguez said weakly, "you came." "Of course I came," Captain Morrison replied, moving to stand beside the hospital bed. "How are you feeling, soldier?" "Better now that you're here, sir. This nurse, she stayed with me the whole time. Made me feel like everything was going to be okay." Rodriguez looked at Sarah with genuine gratitude. "She promised me you'd come, and she kept her word." Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions, watching the interaction between Captain Morrison and his soldier. She could see the deep respect and loyalty that Rodriguez had for his captain, and she remembered feeling that same way once upon a time. Captain Morrison had that effect on people. He inspired them to be better, to push beyond their limits, to never give up even when everything seemed hopeless. "Nurse Martinez is special," Captain Morrison said, glancing at Sarah. "She has a way of taking care of people that goes beyond just medical training." Dr. Williams, who had been quietly observing the interaction, stepped forward. "Private Rodriguez, your surgery went very well. We repaired the fractures in your leg and addressed the internal bleeding. You'll need to stay in the hospital for a few days, but you should make a complete recovery." "Will I be able to return to active duty?" Rodriguez asked, the concern clear in his voice. "That will depend on how well you heal and what your physical therapy progress looks like," Williams explained. "But there's no reason to think you won't be able to return to full duty eventually." Captain Morrison placed a reassuring hand on Rodriguez's shoulder. "Focus on getting better right now. Don't worry about anything else. The team will be here when you're ready to come back." After a few more minutes of conversation, Captain Morrison and Sarah stepped back into the hallway. The evening shift was winding down, and the hospital was quieter than it had been during the busy afternoon. Sarah knew she needed to finish her paperwork and hand over her patients to the night shift, but she also knew that her conversation with Captain Morrison was far from over. "I should finish my shift responsibilities," Sarah said. "But if you want to wait, we could continue talking afterward." Captain Morrison checked his watch. "I have some time. I'll wait in the family lounge if that's okay with you." For the next hour, Sarah went through her end-of-shift routine with unusual attention to detail. She wanted everything to be perfect before she left, partly because she was naturally conscientious, but mostly because she was nervous about the conversation that lay ahead. She kept thinking about what she would say to Captain Morrison, how she would explain the years that had passed since they last saw each other. As she completed her final patient check, Dr. Williams approached her. "Sarah, I hope you don't mind me asking, but how do you know Captain Morrison?" "It's obvious you two have history together." Sarah hesitated before answering. She had never talked about her military background with anyone at the hospital. Her colleagues knew she had served in the Army before becoming a nurse, but she had never shared the details of her deployment or how she had been injured. "We served together in Afghanistan," Sarah said simply. "It was a long time ago." Dr. Williams nodded, seeming to understand that there was more to the story than Sarah was willing to share. "He seems like a good man, and he clearly respects you a great deal." "He is a good man," Sarah agreed. "One of the best leaders I've ever known." After finishing her shift, Sarah found Captain Morrison in the family lounge, reading a military magazine. He looked up when she entered and set the magazine aside. "Ready to talk?" he asked. Sarah nodded and sat down across from him. The lounge was empty except for them, and the silence felt heavy with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. "I want you to know," Captain Morrison began, "that not a day has gone by in the last 9 years that I haven't thought about what happened, about the choices I made and how they affected you." Sarah felt her throat tighten. She had wondered if he ever thought about her, if he ever regretted the mission that had changed both of their lives forever. "You don't need to apologize for doing your job," she said. "You made the right call that day." "Did I?" Captain Morrison asked, his voice filled with doubt. "Sometimes I wonder if there was another way, if I could have found a solution that didn't require such a sacrifice." Sarah looked down at her hands, remembering the events that had led to her injury and medical discharge from the army. It had been a complicated mission in a dangerous part of Afghanistan, and Captain Morrison had been forced to make an impossible decision under extreme pressure. The choice he made had saved lives, but it had also ended Sarah's military career and left her with a permanent reminder of that day. "Tell me about your life now," Captain Morrison said, changing the subject. "Are you happy? Do you have a family?" "I'm happy with my work," Sarah replied. "Being a nurse gives me a sense of purpose that I didn't think I'd find after leaving the military. As for family, there's no one special right now. My career has been my focus." Captain Morrison studied her face, and Sarah had the feeling he could see more than she was comfortable revealing. He had always been good at reading people, understanding what motivated them and what they needed to succeed. It was one of the qualities that made him such an effective leader. "What about you?" Sarah asked. "Are you still active duty?" "Yes, still leading SEAL teams. I've been promoted since you knew me, and I'm stationed at different bases now. But the work is essentially the same." He paused. "I never married. The military life doesn't leave much room for long-term relationships." Sarah suspected there was more to his single status than just the demands of military service, but she didn't press for details. They were both dancing around the deeper issues that connected them, neither quite ready to dive into the painful memories that had shaped their lives. "Can I ask you something?" Captain Morrison said. "When you were going through physical therapy and rehabilitation, did you ever hate me for what happened?" The question caught Sarah off guard, even though she had asked herself the same thing many times over the years. "There were moments when I was angry," she admitted, "when the pain was bad or when I realized my military career was over. But I never hated you. You did what you had to do to save lives. But your life was one of the lives that got changed forever," Captain Morrison pointed out. "And not necessarily for the better." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, thinking about how to respond. "My life was changed," she agreed, "but I'm not sure it was for the worse. Becoming a nurse has given me opportunities to help people in ways I never could have as a soldier. Maybe everything happened the way it was supposed to." Captain Morrison looked skeptical. "Do you really believe that, or are you just trying to make me feel better?" "I believe it," Sarah said, and she was surprised to realize that she meant it. "I loved being a soldier, but I love being a nurse too. Different kind of service, but service nonetheless." They talked for another hour about safer topics. Their careers, their colleagues, changes in the military since Sarah had left. But underneath the surface conversation, both of them were processing the emotions that came with seeing each other again after so many years. There was unfinished business between them, feelings that had never been fully expressed or resolved. As the evening grew later, Captain Morrison finally stood up. "I should probably head back to the base. But Sarah, I'm glad we had this chance to talk. I've wondered about you for years." Sarah stood as well, suddenly reluctant to see him leave. "Will you come back to check on Private Rodriguez while he's recovering here?"
"Probably," Captain Morrison said.
"Would that be okay with you?" "Of course," Sarah replied, though she wasn't sure if she was ready for regular contact with him. He could use the support from his captain. As they walked toward the hospital exit together, Sarah became aware that other staff members were watching them with curiosity. She had always been a private person at work, never sharing much about her personal life. Seeing her with Captain Morrison would undoubtedly generate questions and speculation among her colleagues. "Sarah," Captain Morrison said as they reached the parking garage, "I want you to know that what happened to you in Afghanistan was my responsibility as your commanding officer. If you ever need anything, medical care, financial assistance, anything at all, please don't hesitate to contact me." Sarah felt a flash of anger at his words. "I don't need charity, Captain. I've built a good life for myself." "That's not what I meant," he said quickly. "I just want you to know that you don't have to face everything alone. You never did." The anger faded as quickly as it had come, replaced by something more complicated. Sarah realized that part of her had been angry with Captain Morrison, not for the decision he made that day, but for the way he had disappeared from her life afterward. He had visited her once in the hospital, and then she never saw him again. She had felt abandoned by someone she had trusted and respected. "I should go," Sarah said, feeling emotionally exhausted by the evening's revelations. "It was good to see you again, Captain." "David," he corrected. "You don't have to call me Captain anymore." Sarah nodded but didn't use his first name. It felt too intimate, too much like they were friends instead of former soldiers with a complicated history. As Sarah drove home to her small apartment, she replayed the evening's events in her mind. Seeing Captain Morrison again had brought back memories she had worked hard to suppress, but it had also provided a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. For years, she had wondered what she would say to him if she ever saw him again. Now she knew that the anger and resentment she had carried were less important than she had thought. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the hospital early as usual, but she felt different. Several colleagues commented that she seemed more relaxed, more confident than they had seen her before. Dr. Williams made a point of seeking her out during the morning briefing. "How was your evening?" he asked. "You seem different today." "I'm fine," Sarah replied. "Just a good night's sleep, I think." But Sarah knew the change was more significant than a good night's sleep. The conversation with Captain Morrison had helped her process feelings she had been carrying for nearly a decade. She felt lighter somehow, less burdened by the past. Around noon, Sarah was surprised to see Captain Morrison arrive at the hospital again. She watched from the nurse's station as he went directly to Private Rodriguez's room for a visit. Their conversation seemed animated and positive, with Rodriguez looking much more alert and optimistic than he had the day before. After spending time with Rodriguez, Captain Morrison approached the nurse's station where Sarah was updating patient charts. "How's he doing today?" he asked. "Much better," Sarah replied. "His pain levels are down, and he's been asking about starting physical therapy. The doctors think he'll be able to go home in a few days." Captain Morrison nodded approvingly. "Rodriguez is tough. He'll bounce back from this." There was an awkward pause as they both seemed to search for something else to say. Finally, Captain Morrison spoke again. "I was wondering if you'd like to have coffee sometime." "Not as patient and captain, just as old friends catching up." Sarah hesitated. Part of her wanted to maintain the professional distance they had established, but another part of her was curious about getting to know the person Captain Morrison had become in the years since their military service. "I'm not sure that's a good idea," she said finally. "Our history is complicated. It doesn't have to stay complicated," Captain Morrison replied. "We're different people than we were 9 years ago. Maybe we could start fresh." Before Sarah could respond, Dr. Khalifa was mourning. Williams approached with a medical question that required her immediate attention. By the time she finished dealing with the patient issue, Captain Morrison had left the hospital. Sarah found herself feeling disappointed that their conversation had been interrupted, which surprised her. She hadn't realized how much she wanted to continue talking with him. Over the next few days, Captain Morrison visited Rodriguez regularly during his recovery. Each time he came to the hospital, he made a point of stopping by to talk with Sarah, even if just briefly. Their conversations gradually became more comfortable and natural, though they still avoided discussing their shared military experience in detail. Sarah began to see sides of Captain Morrison that she had never known during their time serving together. He was funny and thoughtful, interested in her opinions about everything from hospital policies to current events. She found herself looking forward to his visits, even though she tried to convince herself that her interest was purely professional. Dr. Williams and the other staff members noticed the developing friendship between Sarah and Captain Morrison, and they were universally positive about it. They had never seen Sarah so engaged with someone outside of work, and they thought the relationship was good for her. "He's clearly interested in more than friendship," Dr. PPA Chen observed one afternoon after Captain Morrison had left. "And you light up when he's around, even if you try to hide it." Sarah dismissed the observation, but privately she wondered if there was truth to it. She had been so focused on her career and on proving herself despite her physical limitations that she hadn't thought much about personal relationships. But spending time with Captain Morrison reminded her that there were other aspects of life she had been neglecting. The morning that Private Rodriguez was scheduled to be discharged, Sarah arrived at work to find Captain Morrison already at the hospital. He was in Rodriguez's room, helping the young soldier get ready to leave and discussing his return-to-duty timeline. "The physical therapy team at the base will work with you to get you back to full strength," Captain Morrison was saying. "Take your time and don't rush the process. We need you healthy for the long term." Sarah listened from the doorway. impressed by Captain Morrison's leadership style. He was demanding but supportive, pushing his people to excel while also caring about their well-being. It reminded her of why she had respected him so much during their military service, despite everything that had happened. After Rodriguez left with transportation back to the base, Captain Morrison lingered at the hospital. He found Sarah in the break room during her lunch break and sat down across from her. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to be completely honest with me." Sarah looked up from her sandwich, curious about what he wanted to know. "Do you think we could ever be friends again? Real friends, without all the baggage from Afghanistan?" Sarah considered the question carefully. The past week of conversations had shown her that they could interact comfortably, even enjoyably, but she wasn't sure if the history between them could ever be fully set aside. "I'd like to try," she said finally, "but I think we need to talk about what happened over there. Really talk about it, not just dance around it like we've been doing." Captain Morrison nodded gravely. "You're right. We do need to have that conversation. Are you ready for it?" Sarah took a deep breath. She had been avoiding that conversation for 9 years, but she knew it was time to face it directly. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." They agreed to meet the following Saturday afternoon at a quiet park outside the city. Sarah spent the week thinking about what she would say, how she would finally address the events that had defined both of their lives nearly a decade earlier. She had never spoken about the details of that day to anyone, not her doctors, not her physical therapists, not even her family. The military had classified much of what happened, and she had been conditioned to keep operational details secret. Captain Morrison arrived at the park first and was sitting on a bench overlooking a small lake when Sarah walked up. She moved slowly, her limp more pronounced than usual, which often happened when she was tired or stressed. He stood when he saw her approaching, and she noticed he looked as nervous as she felt. "Thank you for agreeing to do this," he said as they both sat down on the bench. "I know it's not easy." Sarah watched a family of ducks swimming in the lake, using the peaceful scene to calm her nerves. "I've been thinking about that day for 9 years," she said. "Maybe it's time to finally talk about it." Captain Morrison was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was careful and measured. "I want you to know that I've replayed that mission in my mind thousands of times. I've asked myself if there was any other way to handle the situation, any decision that could have prevented what happened to you. The mission had been a joint operation between Morrison's SEAL team and Sarah's Army Intelligence Unit. They had been tasked with gathering information about enemy activities in a remote village, but the operation had gone wrong almost from the beginning. Intelligence reports had underestimated enemy presence in the area, and what was supposed to be a quiet reconnaissance mission had turned into a firefight. "The intelligence we received was wrong," Sarah said, echoing Morrison's thoughts. "There were 3 times as many insurgents in that village as we expected. When we realized we were outgunned and surrounded, I had to make a choice," Morrison continued. "We could try to fight our way out together, which would have meant significant casualties, or we could create a distraction that would allow most of the team to escape safely." Sarah remembered the moment when Morrison had made his decision. They had been pinned down in a partially collapsed building, taking heavy fire from multiple directions. Radio communication with base had been cut off, and their ammunition was running low. Morrison had identified a way to blow up an enemy ammunition cache that would create enough chaos for his team to escape, but it would require someone to stay behind and manually trigger the explosion. "You volunteered to stay," Sarah said quietly. "You were going to sacrifice yourself to save the rest of us." "It was the right tactical decision," Morrison replied. "I was the commanding officer. It was my responsibility to get everyone else out safely." But Sarah had refused to let Morrison sacrifice himself. As the team's intelligence specialist, she had argued that she was the least critical member for the escape portion of the mission. She had convinced him to let her stay behind to trigger the explosion while he led the others to safety. "I should never have agreed to let you stay," Morrison said, the regret clear in his voice. "You were under my command. It was my job to protect you." "You didn't let me do anything," Sarah corrected. "I made the choice. You gave me an order to fall back with the team, and I refused to follow it." Sarah remembered the argument they had in those final moments before the team's escape. Morrison had ordered her to retreat with the others, but she had insisted on staying behind. She had pointed out that her smaller size would allow her to move more quickly through the building's debris, and that her technical training made her the best candidate to ensure the explosion was properly timed. "You were always stubborn," Morrison said with a slight smile. "Even when we were training stateside, you questioned orders if you thought there was a better way." "Is that a complaint?" Sarah asked. "No," Morrison replied. "It's one of the reasons you were such a good soldier. You thought independently and weren't afraid to speak up when something didn't seem right." The plan had worked perfectly from a tactical standpoint. Sarah had successfully triggered the explosion that destroyed the enemy ammunition cache and created enough confusion for Morrison's team to escape the village safely. But the blast had been larger than expected, and Sarah had been caught in the debris when part of the building collapsed. Her left leg had been crushed, and she had suffered internal injuries that required multiple surgeries to repair. "I was unconscious when they pulled me out of the rubble," Sarah said. "I don't remember the evacuation or the first few days in the field hospital." Morrison had been the one to organize Sarah's rescue. He had refused to leave the area until his team had located her in the collapsed building and evacuated her to medical care. He had stayed with her during the first surgery and had been there when she regained consciousness 3 days later. "When you woke up and realized your leg was badly damaged, you didn't blame me," Morrison said. "I expected you to be angry, but you just asked if everyone else had made it out safely." Sarah remembered that conversation differently. She had been angry, but not at Morrison. She had been angry at the situation, at the faulty intelligence that had led them into an impossible position, at her own body for failing her. But she had never blamed Morrison for the choices he had made under extreme pressure. "I was angry," Sarah admitted, "but not at you. You saved 7 lives that day, including mine. The fact that I was injured doesn't change that." "But your military career was over," Morrison pointed out. "Everything you had worked for, everything you had planned for your future." Sarah had indeed planned a long military career. She had been promoted ahead of schedule and had been selected for advanced training that would have opened doors to high-level intelligence positions. The injury had ended all of those possibilities, forcing her to start over in civilian life. "My military career was over," Sarah agreed, "but that doesn't mean my life was over. It took me a while to understand that." After Sarah had been medically discharged from the army, she had gone through a difficult period of adjustment. The physical rehabilitation had been challenging, but the emotional adjustment had been even harder. She had lost not just her career, but her sense of identity and purpose. For months, she had struggled with depression and had questioned whether she would ever find meaning in civilian life. "What made you decide to become a nurse?" Morrison asked. Sarah smiled, remembering the moment when her new career path had become clear. "I was doing physical therapy at a VA hospital, and I saw how much difference the nurses made in patients' recovery. They weren't just providing medical care, they were giving people hope and helping them rebuild their lives. I realized I wanted to be part of that." Nursing school had been challenging for someone with Sarah's physical limitations, but she had been determined to succeed. Her military training had taught her discipline and perseverance, qualities that served her well as she learned a completely new profession. Her instructors had initially been skeptical about her ability to handle the physical demands of nursing, but she had proven them wrong through hard work and determination. "I'm proud of what you've accomplished," Morrison said, "but I still feel responsible for taking away your first choice." Sarah turned to look at him directly. "David," she said, using his first name for the first time since their reunion, "you need to stop carrying guilt about that day. We were in an impossible situation, and you made the best decision you could with the information you had. I chose to stay behind, and I chose to build a new life afterward. Those were my decisions, not yours." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, processing what Sarah had said. She could see that he was struggling with emotions he had been carrying for years. "I visited you once in the hospital before you were transferred back to the States," he said finally. "Do you remember that?" Sarah remembered. Morrison had come to see her during his brief leave between missions. She had still been heavily medicated and dealing with the reality of her injuries. The conversation had been awkward and painful for both of them, and she had sensed that he was struggling with guilt about what had happened. "You seemed so uncomfortable during that visit," Sarah said. "I thought you blamed me for disobeying orders and getting injured." "I didn't blame you," Morrison said quickly. "I blamed myself. Seeing you in that hospital bed, knowing that your injuries were the result of a mission I had commanded, it was one of the hardest things I've ever had to face. After that hospital visit, Morrison had returned to active duty, and Sarah had never heard from him again. She had wondered over the years if he had simply forgotten about her, moved on to new missions and new responsibilities. Learning that he had actually been struggling with guilt about her injuries put their lack of contact in a different perspective.
"Why didn't you ever try to contact me after I was discharged?" Sarah asked.
I wondered for years if you even remembered what happened. Morrison looked uncomfortable with the question. I wanted to contact you, but I didn't know what to say. I was afraid that hearing from me would just remind you of the worst day of your life. I thought you'd be better off without that reminder. Sarah realized that they had both been making assumptions about the other's feelings without actually communicating. Morrison had stayed away because he thought his presence would be painful for her, while she had interpreted his silence as indifference or blame. I could have used a friend during those first few years, Sarah said gently. Adjusting to civilian life was harder than dealing with the physical injuries.
"I'm sorry," Morrison said, and Sarah could hear the genuine regret in his voice.
I was trying to do what I thought was best for you, but I probably just made things worse. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the ducks on the lake and processing the conversation. Sarah felt a sense of relief at finally addressing the events that had shaped both of their lives. The conversation hadn't erased the past, but it had provided clarity about each other's motivations and feelings. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said. "Do you ever regret staying in the military after what happened?" Morrison considered the question carefully. "No," he said finally. "The military is still where I feel I can make the biggest difference, but I've changed how I approach leadership since that mission. I'm more careful about putting people in dangerous situations, more willing to listen to alternative viewpoints." Sarah could see that their shared experience had affected Morrison deeply, just as it had changed her. He had become a more thoughtful and cautious leader, while she had learned to find purpose in helping people heal rather than in military service. "I want you to know," Morrison said, "that I've never stopped admiring your courage. What you did that day was heroic, even if it came at a personal cost." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. For 9 years, she had wondered if her sacrifice had been worth it, if her decision to stay behind had actually made a difference. Hearing Morrison acknowledge her courage meant more than she had expected. "I need to tell you something," Sarah said, gathering her courage for a confession she had never made to anyone. "There were moments over the years when I wondered if I should have just followed your orders that day. If I had retreated with the team, maybe someone else could have triggered the explosion. Maybe I could have kept my military career." "Do you really think that?" Morrison asked. "Sometimes," Sarah admitted. "Usually when I'm having a particularly difficult day at the hospital, when my leg is hurting and I'm tired of people treating me like I'm fragile." Morrison turned to face her completely. "Sarah, if you had followed orders that day, I would have stayed behind to trigger that explosion myself. I was prepared to die in that building to save my team. Your decision to stay didn't just save my life, it allowed me to continue serving and leading other soldiers. I've probably saved more lives in the years since then because you gave me the chance to keep serving." Sarah had never thought about it that way. She had focused on what she had lost, not on what her sacrifice had allowed Morrison to continue doing. The idea that her decision had indirectly saved other lives through Morrison's continued service put her sacrifice in a completely different perspective. "I never thought about it like that," she said quietly. "And you've saved lives as a nurse, too," Morrison continued. "Maybe not in the same dramatic way as that day in Afghanistan, but every day you go to work, you're helping people heal and recover. Your decision to stay behind led you to a different kind of service, but it's still service." As the afternoon wore on, their conversation shifted to lighter topics. They talked about their current lives, their goals for the future, and their memories of the good times they had shared during their military service. Sarah found herself laughing for the first time in weeks, reminded of Morrison's dry sense of humor and his ability to find hope in difficult situations. "I should probably head home," Sarah said as the sun began to set. "But I'm glad we finally had this conversation. It helps to understand what you were thinking and feeling all those years." "Would you be willing to do this again sometime?" Morrison asked. "Not necessarily the heavy conversations, but just spending time together. I've missed having you in my life." Sarah hesitated. Not because she didn't want to see Morrison again, but because she was afraid of developing feelings that couldn't be reciprocated. He was still active military, still dedicated to a lifestyle that didn't leave much room for serious relationships. She had built a stable, independent life for herself, and she wasn't sure she wanted to complicate it. "I'd like that," she said finally. "But we should take it slowly. We're both different people than we were 9 years ago. We need to get to know each other as we are now." Morrison smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression she had seen from him since their reunion. "I'd like to get to know the person you've become. From what I've seen at the hospital, she's pretty impressive." As they walked back to their cars, Sarah felt lighter than she had in years. The weight of unexpressed emotions and unresolved guilt had been lifted through their honest conversation. She wasn't sure what the future held for their renewed friendship, but she was grateful for the opportunity to move forward without the burden of their complicated past. Over the next few weeks, Morrison began stopping by the hospital regularly, not just to check on patients from his unit, but to visit with Sarah. Their conversations gradually became more personal and comfortable, and Sarah found herself looking forward to his visits more than she cared to admit. Dr. Williams and the other staff members noticed the change in Sarah's demeanor. She seemed more confident and engaged, more willing to take on challenging cases and leadership responsibilities. When Dr. Williams mentioned this to her during their monthly evaluation meeting, Sarah realized that reconnecting with Morrison had given her a sense of closure she hadn't known she needed. "You seem different lately," Dr. Williams observed. "More sure of yourself, if that makes sense." "I think I finally made peace with some things from my past," Sarah replied. "It's helped me focus on the present and future rather than dwelling on what I lost." The change was noticed by patients as well. Sarah had always been a compassionate and skilled nurse, but now there was an additional quality of confidence and authority in her interactions with patients and families. She began taking on more complex cases and was often requested specifically by patients who appreciated her combination of medical expertise and emotional support. One evening, after a particularly busy shift, Sarah was updating patient charts when Morrison appeared at the nurse's station with takeout coffee from her favorite cafe. "I thought you might need caffeine," he said, setting the coffee down beside her computer. "You thought right," Sarah replied gratefully. "It's been a long day." Morrison sat down in the chair across from her desk, something that had become a comfortable routine for them. "Want to talk about it?" Sarah found herself telling him about the difficult cases she had handled that day. A car accident victim who reminded her of Rodriguez, an elderly man whose family was struggling with end-of-life decisions. Morrison listened thoughtfully, asking questions and offering insights from his own experience dealing with trauma and difficult decisions. "You know," Morrison said when Sarah had finished describing her day, "I think you're exactly where you're supposed to be. The military lost a good soldier when you were injured, but the medical field gained an exceptional nurse." Sarah felt herself blushing at the compliment, something that had been happening more frequently during Morrison's visits. She was developing feelings for him that went beyond their shared history, and she wasn't sure how to handle the situation. "David," she said, using his first name more easily now, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Do you ever think about having a different life? Something outside the military?" Morrison was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Sometimes," he admitted, "especially lately. Seeing you build a meaningful life outside the military has made me think about what else might be possible." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat at his words, but she tried to keep her expression neutral. "What would you do if you left the military?" "I'm not sure," Morrison said. "I've been a SEAL for my entire adult life. It's hard to imagine doing anything else. But maybe it's time I started thinking about it." Before Sarah could respond, Williams approached with an urgent patient situation that required her immediate attention. By the time she finished dealing with the emergency, Morrison had left for the evening. Sarah found herself disappointed that their conversation had been interrupted, and she realized how much she had been looking forward to hearing more about his thoughts on leaving the military. That night, Sarah lay awake thinking about the direction her relationship with Morrison was taking. What had started as an unexpected reunion was evolving into something deeper and more complex. She was falling for him, but she wasn't sure if he felt the same way, and she was afraid of risking their renewed friendship by admitting her feelings. The next morning brought news that would test both of their emotions in ways they hadn't expected. Morrison arrived at the hospital earlier than usual, looking tense and serious. Sarah immediately knew that something was wrong. "What's happened?" she asked as soon as she saw his expression. "My unit just received deployment orders," Morrison said quietly. "We're shipping out to Syria in 3 weeks." Sarah felt her stomach drop at Morrison's words. Just when they had rebuilt their friendship and were exploring the possibility of something more, he was being deployed to another dangerous part of the world. The timing felt cruel, like history was repeating itself in the worst possible way. "How long will you be gone?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "At least 8 months, possibly longer depending on how the mission develops," Morrison replied. "It's a counter-terrorism operation, working with local forces to eliminate insurgent networks." Sarah nodded, familiar with the type of mission he was describing. It was exactly the kind of dangerous, unpredictable deployment that had brought them together in Afghanistan 9 years earlier. The thought of Morrison facing similar risks again made her feel sick with worry. "Are you nervous about it?" she asked. Morrison considered the question carefully. "I'm always nervous before a deployment. It means I'm taking the mission seriously and thinking about all the things that could go wrong, but I'm also excited about the work we'll be doing. This is what I trained for." Over the next 3 weeks, Morrison visited the hospital almost daily. Their conversations took on a more urgent quality, as if they were both aware that time was running out. They talked about everything: their hopes, their fears, their memories, their dreams for the future. Sarah found herself memorizing details about Morrison that she hadn't noticed before. The way he rubbed his left temple when he was thinking hard, the small scar on his chin from a training accident, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about his team. Dr. Williams had given Sarah permission to adjust her schedule so she could spend more time with Morrison before his deployment. The hospital staff had become invested in their relationship, and everyone understood the emotional difficulty of the impending separation. "You know," Dr. Chen said to Sarah one afternoon, "you should tell him how you feel before he leaves. You'll regret it if you don't." Sarah had been thinking the same thing, but she was terrified of the potential consequences. What if Morrison didn't feel the same way? What if admitting her feelings made his deployment more difficult? What if he was killed overseas, and their last conversation was an awkward rejection? 1 week before Morrison's scheduled departure, Sarah made a decision. She invited him to dinner at her apartment, something they had never done before. All of their previous meetings had been in public places: the hospital, the park, restaurants. Having him in her personal space would force a level of intimacy that might give her the courage to be honest about her feelings. Morrison arrived at Sarah's apartment with flowers and wine, gestures that seemed more romantic than friendly. Sarah's apartment was small but cozy, decorated with photos from her nursing school graduation and artwork from local artists. Morrison studied the space carefully, as if trying to understand her better through her living environment. "This suits you," he said approvingly. "It feels like a home." Sarah had cooked his favorite meal, remembered from their time serving together in Afghanistan. They ate by candlelight and talked about anything except his impending deployment. Sarah found herself studying his face, trying to memorize every detail in case this was their last evening together. After dinner, they moved to Sarah's small living room and sat together on the couch. The conversation gradually slowed, and Sarah realized that this was the moment she had been both anticipating and dreading. She needed to tell Morrison how she felt before he left, but she didn't know how to begin. "Sarah," Morrison said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you before I leave." Sarah's heart began racing. "What is it?" Morrison took her hand, the first time he had touched her since their reunion at the hospital. "These past few weeks with you have been the happiest I've been in years. You've reminded me what it feels like to connect with someone on a deep level, to care about someone more than just as a friend." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. "David, Let me finish," Morrison said gently. "I know the timing is terrible. I'm leaving for a dangerous deployment, and I have no right to ask you to wait for me or to complicate your life with my feelings. But I couldn't leave without telling you that I love you. I think I've loved you since Afghanistan, but I was too afraid and too guilty to admit it." Sarah stared at him in shock. "You love me?" I love your courage, your compassion, your determination to build a meaningful life despite everything you've been through. I love the way you care for your patients, and the way you make everyone around you feel valued. I love the person you were in the military, and the person you've become as a nurse." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the intensity of his words and the emotions they stirred up. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've been falling for you all over again these past few weeks, but I was afraid to say anything." Morrison pulled her closer, and they kissed for the first time. It was gentle and tentative at first, then deeper and more passionate as 9 years of suppressed emotions finally found expression. When they broke apart, both of them were crying. "What are we going to do?" Sarah asked. "You're leaving in a week for 8 months in a war zone." "I don't know," Morrison admitted. "But I know I want to try to make this work. I want to have something to come back to, something to fight for beyond just the mission." They spent the rest of the evening talking about practical arrangements for his deployment. Morrison would have limited communication opportunities, but he would be able to email and call occasionally. Sarah would continue working at the hospital, but she promised to write to him regularly and to be there when he returned. The week leading up to Morrison's departure passed quickly. Sarah took time off work to spend his final days with him, and they tried to create as many positive memories as possible. They visited his favorite restaurants, walked through the city's museums, and spent hours just talking about their hopes for the future. The night before Morrison left, Sarah stayed at his base housing. They didn't sleep much, both too aware that it might be months before they saw each other again. In the early morning hours, Morrison talked about his concerns for the upcoming mission and his hopes for what they might build together when he returned. "Promise me something?" Morrison said as they lay together in the darkness. "Promise me you'll take care of yourself while I'm gone. Don't take unnecessary risks at work. Don't push yourself too hard." "I promise," Sarah replied. "But you have to promise me the same thing. Come back to me in one piece." The next morning, Sarah drove Morrison to the base where his team was assembling for departure. The goodbye was brief and public, with other families and couples saying their own farewells nearby. Morrison kissed her once more and whispered, "I love you. Wait for me." The first few weeks after Morrison's deployment were the hardest. Sarah threw herself into her work, taking on extra shifts and additional responsibilities to keep her mind occupied. Her colleagues noticed her increased dedication and began relying on her for more complex cases and leadership duties. Dr. Williams called Sarah into his office 1 month after Morrison's departure. "Sarah, I want to talk to you about a promotion opportunity. We're creating a new position for a senior nurse coordinator in the emergency department. You'd be responsible for training new staff, developing protocols, and liaising with other departments. I think you'd be perfect for the role." Sarah was surprised by the offer. The position would represent a significant step forward in her career and would come with increased responsibilities and better pay. But it would also require her full attention and commitment at a time when her personal life felt uncertain. "Can I think about it?" Sarah asked. "Of course. Take as much time as you need." That evening, Sarah sat at her computer and composed an email to Morrison describing the job opportunity. She wanted his input on the decision, but she also knew that he had more pressing concerns to deal with. His most recent email had described increased activity in their operational area and longer missions with less communication opportunities. Morrison's response came 3 days later. "I'm so proud of you for being considered for this promotion. You deserve this recognition, and I think you should accept it. Don't put your career on hold because of my deployment. I want you to keep growing and achieving your goals." Sarah accepted the promotion and found that the increased responsibilities helped her cope with Morrison's absence. She was busier than ever, but she felt more fulfilled and challenged in her work. The new position also brought her into contact with hospital administrators and medical staff from other departments, expanding her professional network and influence within the organization. 2 months into Morrison's deployment, Sarah received news that tested her emotional strength in ways she hadn't expected. Morrison's unit had been involved in a firefight, and several team members had been injured. Morrison himself had suffered a concussion and some shrapnel wounds, but was expected to make a full recovery. The news came through official military channels, which meant Sarah had to wait several anxious days before Morrison was able to contact her directly. When his email finally arrived, it was brief but reassuring. "I'm okay. Injuries are minor, and I'm already back on duty. Don't worry about me. Focus on your new job and taking care of yourself. But Sarah couldn't help worrying. The incident reminded her of how dangerous Morrison's work was and how quickly everything could change. She found herself checking her email obsessively and jumping every time her phone rang, afraid that the next communication might bring worse news. Dr. Chen noticed Sarah's increased anxiety and pulled her aside one afternoon. "You're worried about Captain Morrison, aren't you?" Sarah nodded, grateful to have someone to talk to about her fears. "He was injured in a firefight 2 weeks ago. He says he's fine, but I keep thinking about everything that could go wrong over there. Being in love with someone in a dangerous profession is never easy," Dr. Professor Chen said sympathetically. "But you can't let the worry consume you. Morrison needs to know that you're strong and taking care of yourself. If you fall apart, it will only make his job harder." Sarah realized that Dr. Chen was right. She had to find a way to manage her anxiety while still supporting Morrison from a distance. She began attending a support group for military families, which helped her connect with others who understood the unique challenges of loving someone in active duty. As the months passed, Sarah and Morrison developed a routine of communication that worked despite the distance and time zone differences. Morrison would email when he could, usually once or twice a week, and they would have video calls whenever his schedule and internet connectivity allowed. Sarah looked forward to these communications more than anything else in her week. Morrison's emails revealed a man who was growing and changing during his deployment. He wrote about his team, his missions, and his thoughts about the future with increasing clarity about what he wanted from life. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said about finding purpose in helping people heal," he wrote in one email. "I'm starting to think there might be other ways for me to serve beyond active military duty." 6 months into the deployment, Morrison's emails began hinting at the possibility of leaving active duty when his current contract expired. He had been promoted during the deployment and had been offered opportunities for advanced training and leadership positions, but he seemed more interested in discussing civilian career options. "I've been talking to some of the medical personnel here about what it takes to become a physician assistant or nurse practitioner," Morrison wrote. "I think my military experience could translate well to emergency medicine or trauma surgery. What do you think about the idea of both of us working in healthcare?" Sarah was thrilled by Morrison's interest in joining the medical field, but she was careful not to push him toward any particular decision. She knew how difficult it was to leave the military and start over in civilian life, and she wanted him to make the choice that felt right for his own goals and interests. As Morrison's scheduled return date approached, Sarah found herself feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness. They had maintained their relationship through 8 months of separation, but she wondered how they would adjust to being together again. Would their connection be as strong in person as it had been in their emails and video calls? Would Morrison's experiences during deployment change how he felt about their future together? 1 week before Morrison's expected return, Sarah received an unexpected phone call from his commanding officer. Her heart immediately began racing, fearing the worst possible news. "Ms. Martinez," the officer said, "I'm calling to let you know that Captain Morrison's team has been selected for a special assignment that will extend their deployment by an additional 2 months. I wanted you to hear this from me rather than through official channels." Sarah felt devastated by the news. She had been counting down the days until Morrison's return, and the extension felt like a cruel setback. But she also understood that military deployments were unpredictable, and extensions were a common reality of military life. When Morrison called her later that day to explain the situation himself, Sarah could hear the disappointment in his voice. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I know you were looking forward to me coming home. I was looking forward to it too." "It's okay," Sarah said, though her voice betrayed her emotions. "I understand that this is your job. I'll wait for you, no matter how long it takes." The additional 2 months tested both of their emotional reserves in ways the first 8 months hadn't. They were both exhausted by the separation and ready to be together again. Morrison's emails became more frequent but also more focused on their future plans, as if he was using the extra time to finalize his thoughts about leaving the military. Finally, 10 months after his deployment began, Morrison returned to the United States. Sarah was waiting at the military base when his transport arrived, along with dozens of other family members and friends. When Morrison walked down the ramp in his combat uniform, looking tired but healthy, Sarah felt overwhelmed with relief and joy. Their reunion was emotional and intense. Morrison looked older and more serious than when he had left, marked by the experiences of his extended deployment. But when he saw Sarah, his face lit up with the same smile she remembered from their early days together. "I missed you so much," Morrison said as he held her tightly. "I thought about you every single day." "I missed you too," Sarah replied, tears streaming down her face. "Welcome home." The first few weeks of Morrison's return were an adjustment period for both of them. He was dealing with the normal readjustment challenges that all deployed service members face, while Sarah had to adapt to having him back in her daily life after months of independence. But their underlying connection remained strong, and they gradually found their rhythm as a couple. Morrison spent his post-deployment leave visiting Sarah at work and getting to know her colleagues better. Dr. Williams and the other hospital staff were impressed by Morrison's intelligence and his genuine interest in their medical work. Several doctors encouraged him to consider pursuing medical training, reinforcing his own growing interest in joining the healthcare field. "You have the leadership skills and the ability to work under pressure that would make you an excellent addition to any medical team," Dr. Williams told Morrison during one of his hospital visits. "Have you given serious thought to becoming a physician assistant?" Morrison had indeed given it serious thought, and he had used his deployment time to research educational requirements and career options in emergency medicine. "I think I'd like to try it," Morrison said. "I've always been interested in medicine, and I think my military experience would translate well." 3 weeks after Morrison's return, he made a decision that surprised even Sarah with its definitiveness. He submitted his resignation from active duty, choosing not to re-enlist when his current contract expired. Instead, he applied to a physician assistant program that specialized in training veterans for civilian medical careers. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked when Morrison told her about his decision. "The military is all you've ever known." "I'm sure," Morrison replied. "The deployment gave me time to think about what I really want from life, and what I want is to build something meaningful with you. I can't do that if I'm constantly being sent to war zones around the world." Morrison's transition from military to civilian life was challenging, but ultimately successful. He was accepted into an accelerated physician assistant program designed for veterans, and he threw himself into his medical studies with the same dedication he had shown as a SEAL officer. Sarah helped him study and provided emotional support during the most difficult parts of his training. 2 years later, Morrison graduated at the top of his PA class and was offered a position in the emergency department at Metropolitan General Hospital, working alongside Sarah in the same trauma bay where they had been reunited. Williams, who had become a mentor to both of them, officiated at their wedding ceremony 6 months later. On their wedding day, Sarah wore a beautiful dress that showed her wedding ring, but also revealed the small scar on her left leg where her old injury had healed. Morrison wore his military dress uniform, and many of their colleagues from both the hospital and the military attended the celebration. During his wedding speech, Morrison talked about the journey that had brought them together and apart, and together again. 9 years ago, Sarah saved my life and the lives of my entire team through her courage and sacrifice. Today, she's saving lives every day through her work as a nurse, and she saved my life again by giving me a reason to build a future worth fighting for. Sarah responded by talking about how Morrison had taught her that strength wasn't about avoiding vulnerability, but about facing challenges with courage and determination. "David showed me that sometimes the most difficult decisions lead to the most meaningful outcomes. Our story isn't about overcoming disability or trauma. It's about finding purpose and love in unexpected places." 5 years after their wedding, Sarah and Morrison were both thriving in their medical careers at Metropolitan General. Sarah had been promoted to Director of Nursing for Emergency Services, while Morrison had become one of the most respected physician assistants on the trauma team. They worked together seamlessly, their shared military experience and deep personal connection making them an incredibly effective medical partnership. Dr. Williams, now the hospital's chief of staff, often pointed to Sarah and Morrison as examples of the kind of dedicated professionals he wanted to recruit. "They understand that medicine is about more than just technical skills," he would tell new staff members. "It's about courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to put other people's needs above your own comfort. One Tuesday morning, almost exactly 6 years after Private Rodriguez's accident had brought them back together, Sarah and Morrison were working in the trauma bay when an ambulance brought in a young female soldier who had been injured in a training accident. As they worked to stabilize her injuries, the soldier asked them to contact her commanding officer. "Please call Captain Thompson," the soldier said weakly. "She needs to know what happened to her team." Sarah and Morrison exchanged a meaningful look, both thinking about the chain of events that had led to their own reunion in this same trauma bay years earlier. As Morrison worked to treat the soldier's injuries, Sarah stepped outside to make the phone call to Captain Thompson, just as she had called Morrison about Rodriguez all those years ago. When Captain Thompson arrived at the hospital an hour later, Sarah immediately recognized something familiar in her bearing and demeanor. She was a young woman, probably in her early 30s, who carried herself with the same confident authority that Sarah remembered from her own military service. "How is she?" Captain Thompson asked when she arrived at the hospital. "She's going to be fine," Morrison assured her. "The injuries look worse than they are. She should be back to full duty within a few months." As Captain Thompson sat with her injured soldier, Sarah found herself thinking about the cycles of service, sacrifice, and healing that connected all of their stories. The young captain cared for her soldiers just as Morrison had cared for his team, just as Sarah now cared for her patients. The specific circumstances changed, but the underlying commitment to serving others remained constant. Later that evening, as Sarah and Morrison drove home from their shift, they talked about the injured soldier and her captain. "Do you ever miss it?" Morrison asked. "The military, I mean." Sarah considered the question carefully. "I miss parts of it," she said. "I miss the sense of mission and the deep bonds you form with people who share dangerous experiences, but I don't miss the uncertainty and the constant separations." "I feel the same way," Morrison agreed. "But I think we found a way to keep the best parts of military service. The mission orientation, the teamwork, the commitment to something bigger than ourselves, while building a more stable life together." Sarah smiled at her husband, still sometimes amazed by the journey that had brought them from that battlefield in Afghanistan to their current life together. "We're lucky," she said. "Not everyone gets a second chance to build something meaningful with someone they love." "We're not lucky," Morrison corrected gently. "We worked for this. We made difficult choices and faced our fears and didn't give up when things got complicated. Luck had nothing to do with it." As they pulled into their driveway, Sarah reflected on Morrison's words. He was right that their relationship had required hard work, honest communication, and mutual support through difficult transitions. But she also believed they were lucky to have found each other again, lucky to have been given the opportunity to build a life that honored both their past service and their current commitment to healing others. That night, Sarah looked at herself in the bathroom mirror before going to bed, as she had done countless times over the years since her injury. Her limp was still visible, and probably always would be, but instead of seeing it as a sign of weakness or limitation, she now saw it as a reminder of her strength, her courage, and the journey that had led her to everything she valued most in her life. She thought about all the people who had underestimated her over the years because of her physical limitations, and about how she had proven them wrong not through dramatic gestures, but through consistent dedication and quiet competence. The doctors who had doubted her abilities, the nurses who had whispered about her weakness, the patients who had initially questioned her qualifications. All of them had eventually come to respect her skills and appreciate her compassion. The young soldier who would recover from her training accident because of Sarah and Morrison's medical care would probably never know about their military background or the personal history that connected them. But she would benefit from their combined experiences, their understanding of what it meant to serve and sacrifice, and their commitment to helping others heal and rebuild their lives. As Sarah got into bed beside Morrison, she thought about the conversation they would have with Captain Thompson the next day, when the young officer returned to check on her soldier. Sarah planned to give her the same advice that someone should have given her years ago, that strength comes not from avoiding injury or hardship, but from how you respond when life challenges you in unexpected ways. Morrison was already asleep, exhausted from their long shift in the trauma bay. Sarah watched him for a moment, grateful for the man who had saved her life twice, once on a battlefield in Afghanistan, and once by showing her that love could survive separation, trauma, and fundamental life changes. Tomorrow would bring new patients, new challenges, and new opportunities to make a difference in people's lives. Sarah.